Hey, welcome to Page Break. I'm your host, Brian McClellan, recording this intro on the first day of spring here in the mountains of Utah. My guest today is science fiction and fantasy author Ken Liu. Ken is known for his wonderful Silkpunk epic fantasy series, The Dandelion Dynasty, and has written numerous award-winning short stories and novellas. He also speaks and consults all over the world on many different topics. Ken and I chat about his experience having a story adapted by Netflix's Love, Death, and Robots, and the glut of stories available to entertain us in the modern world. We talk extensively about his work as a futurist and the problems with trying to predict pretty much anything. In particular, recent advances in artificial intelligence and what that means for the creative industries. Enjoy my conversation with Ken Liu. Well, Ken, thank you again for coming on to chat with me. It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard your name a lot. I read Grace of Kings back when it came out and loved it. I was just doing my regular research this morning, and I hadn't realized that you had a story in the Netflix anthology, Love, Death, and Robots.
Well, first of all, thank you, Brian. It's a real pleasure to be here. Yes, that was quite a fun experience to see my work turned into the animation. I thought that was a lot of fun.
Did you get to be involved in that at all, or was it just like assigning a thing for somebody to do it?
It's the latter. I mean, I actually do quite a bit of adaptation for my work, but in that particular case, they had a very specific vision of what they wanted to do. So it really was just me signing a piece of paper, and that was the end of that. I didn't even see it until, everybody else.
But that is quite cool, though. Like, I've gotten some rights picked up, but I've never obviously had anything adapted. And I'm fascinated by the mentality that you have to kind of go into with it.
The thing that just surprised me was just how much greater the reach is, for something like TV. I mean, I don't know how many people read that story. It was in my collection, so anybody who read my collection did get to read it, and it was originally published on Strange Horizons, and so readers of the magazine got to read it. But I definitely got a lot more people commenting on it afterwards, and I'm sure the people who actually even knew that it was based on my story, it was a minority of the people who got to see it. I mean, the way Netflix does it, they get you right onto the next episode. So you really have to be very careful to look at the credits to even see me. Otherwise, they'll just skip right over. So the fact that a large number of people even recognized me from that just makes me realize just how big, the reach is.
Right. And when you have when you have a new thing like that, and it's part of an anthology, obviously, but when you have a new season of something like that just pop up on Netflix and it's on their front page for a week or two, that's a crazy reach.
Yeah, it is just interesting to compare, how much greater the cultural reach is. I mean, I'm not, I don't really, I think there are different strengths to each medium, whether you're writing or making a TV show, but it definitely it struck me. I was very struck by the fact that so many more people watch TV. Right.
It's weird trying to explain to kind of like a lay person, like the reach difference on these types of things, because it could be, it could be for a quite a successful author. It could be, 100,000 for their book, but then you go to like a TV show and then suddenly several million, and then you go to like a movie and then suddenly 100 million, and it's absolutely wild.
I mean, it is kind of cool that we get to live in this age, which is, I think, the golden age of TV, right? I mean, streaming TV has allowed shows that never could have been made before, and you're just getting some of the best stories ever told on the small screen. I'm really amazed. I'm sure you feel the same way. We don't have enough time to watch all the shows we want to watch. It's incredible.
Oh no, there's too much stuff out there. Like I feel like I'm bombarded every week with like a different thing that everyone's talking about.
Same.
And I'm like, man, I'm on the thing from a year ago still. It's how do you catch up?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I don't know how you ever do it. And then not to mention there's games too, another medium in which it's just like so many amazing things are being done, so many great stories. Oh man, we are totally spoiled in terms of good stories.
Oh yeah. Everybody has those dumb jokes up their sleeve that they pull out at the appropriate moment. One of my dumb jokes is whenever you hear somebody talking about something horrible that happened in the past, my dumb joke is, well, they didn't have television. Clearly, they had to occupy their time with something.
Oh man, yeah. I often think like people who are alive today, we have consumed more good stories than any generation alive in the past. It really is astounding. It's like we've seen more good pictures, we've consumed more good stories, we've read more. Really, all of us. It's really quite striking to think about. How profound and how lucky we are in so many ways.
Yeah, for sure. It is fascinating to like kind of try to wrap your mind around how the consumption of entertainment has changed just in the last 100 years. Like it's wild.
Or even the last 20 years, I would say. It's wild, right? It's like
Yeah, yeah.
exponential. I mean, we got to see, if you're talking about 100 years, we got to see the rise of at least two, if not three or more, entirely new mediums for storytelling. I mean, we got to see film being invented as a language. I mean, we're not that far from the days when people would exclaim at a train coming at the camera. That was like, amazing. And then everything about the language of film got invented in the 100 years after that. Montages, reaction shots, slow-mo, tone. I mean, just everything. Now we consume films as though we are born to understand this language, but it's a really strange new medium that we've all had to learn to work with. And then you've got TV, which is its own language, and you've got games, which is changing on a daily basis. Man, it's really amazing. If you're like a historian of media, you're studying the history of storytelling and the grammar of storytelling, this is just an amazing age to go through.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And you also have a keen interest in futurism and kind of looking ahead. It's one of those terms that I have heard a lot, and I've always thought, okay, I have a vague idea what that means. Can you explain it a little bit to the listener?
Yeah, futurism is one of those terms that gets thrown about a lot, and it doesn't have a precise definition. Um, I get hired as a futurist in different contexts, and usually I go there, and people who show up often have very different areas of expertise. Some of them are scientists who have thought very deeply about their technical area of expertise, and they can speak about the impact of that area of technical knowledge. Some are economists, and they can speak about their projections and models. I tend to come at it slightly differently. I'm a narrative futurologist. So what I do is I study the history of storytelling, imagining the future, and I talk about what are the ways for us to tell stories about the future, to imagine the future that will either lead to profitable or just productive ways of imagining versus ways that are not. I tend to advise, governments, institutions, corporations on my focus is on storytelling. So I focus on the idea that part of trying to engage with the future is to figure out what is the story you're trying to tell as an individual, as an institution, as a country, as a branch of the military, what have you. What is your story? What is the story you imagine yourself part of? And what does that mean when you are locked into a story? What are the things you don't notice? And what are the things that you pay too much attention to? Because a recurring theme, just to back up a little bit, a recurring theme of my work comes from the fact that I worked as a technologist for many years. I both developed technology, but also later on worked as an expert witness in technology cases. So for those kind of engagements, I ended up becoming an amateur historian of technology, if you will. And I've developed a bunch of scenarios and theories as to how technology actually develops and how we are constantly blinded by our tendency to tell stories about the future, such that we cease to realize how unpredictable and how utterly unstoryable the future really is. So it's sort of ironic because my focus is on trying to get people to understand the stories they're telling, conscious or unconsciously, trying to get them to recognize it. Because my honest feeling is, even though I tell stories about the future for a living, telling stories about the future is a very dangerous thing. You end up being blinded by your stories, and you end up not realizing the things that are not in the story. And so I just remind people over and over again, don't be seduced and fooled by your own story into thinking that's how the future will be. The future will constantly always surprise you. The best thing you can do is to just leave yourself open and be prepared for cataclysmic change. But don't fool yourself into thinking that because you can tell a story that makes sense of what's happening now and you can envision a future, that's the way the future will be. It almost never turns out that.
See, that I think that is absolutely fascinating. Kind of this idea of looking backwards to look forwards. Man, that is really interesting. Like the trying to grasp, kind of trying to get your mind around this idea that people have always told stories about the future, and they're almost always wrong.
Yes, exactly.
And trying to use that to develop how you react and interact with the future that we have suddenly now.
Exactly. I want people to develop an immunity to stories. It sounds ironic because I'm a storyteller, but I want people to develop an immunity to stories because stories can be some of the worst ways to fool yourself into thinking you know what's coming. Because we just have a tendency of extrapolating from current trends and saying, oh, this is what happened in history, so this must be how it's going to be. It's never like that. Never.
Well, and I think of like those old stories. I can't remember if this was one I read in an Edgar Allan Poe anthology or not, but there's one I was just like popped into my head that was like a guy that took a balloon up and then eventually got to the moon. You know, there's these there's these funny things, the way that people started thinking about, you know, space, for instance.
Oh, you remember Jules Verne, right? With that whole, you know, in his novel, it was a bunch of Americans who, after the Civil War, didn't know what to do with their expertise in firearms. So they developed this huge cannon to shoot, you know, a capsule to the moon. That was the idea.
Oh, and it's interesting to see what people in the past thought of and what they got so wrong. You know, like you look back,
it's wild.
And you think of what people in the 50s, they thought we were going to be living in this age of nuclear powered cars and things like that.
Oh, yeah. I love, so when I do the futurism talks, I love showing people retrofuturism images. So, for example, there were these artists from, I think, maybe just a little bit over 100 years ago, who imagined life in the year 2000, right? So they painted these images, and it's just wild to see these pictures and sort of to see what they thought wouldn't change versus what they thought would. And it's just amazing. They got all these ladies and gentlemen in their you know, very elaborate dresses flying around on a pair of wings, completely impractical. And you're like, how could they even imagine that this could work? They've got these automated vacuum cleaners, but they're not truly automated because you actually had to have a maid stand there with a remote control to control these little vacuum cleaners. And I'm just like, oh my God, they thought, you know, this would be the way.
Well, and you look at that and try to compare it to how we actually ended up, because it's like we didn't end up with, you know, personal flying machines, but we have a thing in our pocket that connects us to the entire human race and the sum of all of our history and knowledge. And that's why, and like most people have that in their pocket.
Right. And that was something that was not really imagined 100 years ago. That was just not where people's imagination went to. So, you know, today we imagine the future, you know, people like me tell stories about the future. And, you know, there's no doubt that in 100 years, they'll look back on these stories and just laugh at them, you know, because they're not at all aimed at the direction where things actually go. I have no illusion about our ability to predict the future in that sense. So I'm sometimes a little bit of an oddball at these conferences because, you know, everyone else is projecting these lovely images of the future. And I go up there and my message basically is, none of this is going to happen. This is all nonsense. Do not listen to any of this. And people are like, you're not really helping.
Well, it does. It's almost like a crapshoot, right? Like, because some of those things could totally come true.
They could,
but nobody actually knows. Like,
no.
And in today, in kind of the way that we're all connected with Twitter and all of the social media garbage and everything, everyone has a hot take about what tomorrow is going to be like. What's the big stock tip? What's the new technology jump? All of that stuff.
Yeah, it's true. And, the thing is, once in a while, some people do get it right. But I always wondered, did they get it right more because they were lucky versus they really knew something we didn't? It's hard because historically, what you can see is every time there's a problem that people race to solve, there are hundreds of different teams around the world all trying to solve the problem. And from the point before the moment the breakthrough happens, it's really, really hard to tell which one's going to make it. It's just almost impossible, I think. But once the breakthrough happens and you look back, you can manufacture all kinds of reasons for why that particular solution was inevitable. It had to be the one to succeed. And over again, I tell people, this is the narrative fallacy. This is our tendency to come up with causes to explain the universe and to make it seem more logical and reasonable than it really is. It's just not. The universe is very random and very unpredictable. And there's a lot of survivorship bias, a lot of narrative bias, a lot of tendency to justify why we are where we are. But really, don't get fooled by that. It's not a healthy mindset to have.
But it's so human nature.
It is.
Like,
it is.
Because it's terrifying. The idea of absolute chaos, the idea that a guy has the cure for cancer in his head and gets hit by a bus before he can write it down, like all that stuff, that's really scary to the average person.
It really is. And the thing is, I want to remind people, which is that we tend to think that there's the cure for cancer, when in reality, there may be hundreds of different ways to cure cancer. It's just not clear which way is going to succeed in the end. And once it happens, let's not make innovation seem more unlikely than it actually really is. Even if that particular solution didn't happen, some other solution would have happened.
Yeah. Well, and you get that sort of thing in history where you look back and like a similar leap forward happens in different places across the world at the same time.
That's right.
And that's kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah, it is. That's why alternate histories are so fun, right? I mean, we love that, trying to imagine how things could have been different if we had just gone down slightly different path. I love storytelling. That's why, we do what we do.
So I'm really fascinated by this idea that you like end up at these conferences where they're trying to predict the future and they're trying to talk about, what's happening tomorrow and 20 years from now and all that stuff. It almost feels like what you end up kind of doing, and this may be totally way off, but is almost like a predictive propaganda, we're trying to create a story around what we think will happen in the future.
Something like that, I guess. I think you can say that that's what a lot of people do. I guess what I think of is what I try to do is to inoculate people against being fooled by propaganda, because it's really easy to go to one of these conferences and be so convinced by these presentations and say, oh, that's got to be the way it's going to be. We got to prepare for that particular future. Well, I'm not saying that future is not going to happen, but my job, as I view it, is to inoculate people against the tendency to be too convinced by stories. I want to tell everyone, look, that story is very convincing, and I can tell the story about the opposite that's going to sound just as convincing. There's no way to know which one's going to be true or something entirely different from both of those scenarios. The thing you got to do, though, is to remember that. So this is the second part of my presentation, which is usually you just have to be prepared for change. All we know is that things are going to be very different. You got to be ready to pivot and flex and try to figure out the best way you can flow towards the future. However, the one thing you can also do is to really interrogate yourself and ask yourself, what is the story that you really believe in? The story that embodies the values you care about the most? Because those are the things you got to hold on to. And if you know what those values are and what the stories that matter are, you will be ready for any change because you'll know what to care about and what to discard. You will be able to discard all the stuff that don't contribute to that core vision and hold on to it. And then no matter how things change, you'll be ready. So, I tell people there are two types of stories. There are the stories that really lead you down the wrong path because they convince you that things are going to be a certain way. And if you really believe that and you're not ready for any other change, you're kind of screwed. But there are also stories that are really good. The stories that tell you who you are in a fundamental value-based way. You hold on to those stories because then you'll be ready to shift and change and to adjust to whatever changes come.
Yeah. I feel like that. I feel like I can almost hear kind of your history as a lawyer and as a consultant in that, because it's very goal oriented. It's very structured, but it's also kind of coded in storytelling. And
it is. It's because fundamentally that's all we are. We think we're convinced by data. We think we're making decisions based on rational analysis. And I'm not saying that's entirely an illusion. There is some truth to it. But a lot of the times, the thing that really motivates us is this emotional connection with whatever story that has convinced us. And but I don't think that's a bad thing. I keep on saying so far that we got to be careful about being deceived by the narrative fallacy. But the counterpoint to that is, deep down, we are just collections of stories and emotions and values, and we can't deny that very human aspect of who we are. The things that we are committed to at our deepest level are not things we can justify by some sort of cold rational analysis. They're just not. There are things that we have an emotional connection to: our love of country, our love of family, our love of whatever cultural religious tradition that we hold dear to. These are not rational convictions. They're just not. They're emotional. And you have to understand that and accept that. That is just how, that's part of being human. These are the stories that move us. At our core, our deepest ethical commitments are stories.
Hey, Page Break listeners. Brian here, rudely interrupting myself for a bit of a plug. Making a podcast isn't free, and I'm hoping that you enjoy it enough to pitch in a pittance. To do so, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak, where you can toss as little as $3 a month into the tip jar, $5 a month to get the podcast ad-free and early, and $10 a month to hear your name in the credits and feel a smug sense of superiority. You can also buy my books from your favorite retailer, or direct from my website. Thanks to everyone who contributes. Now back to me. I imagine that kind of in this particular moment, that what's bombarding you right now is probably the AI stuff.
Oh yeah,
because we've been getting just absolutely hammered with that. The last month or two, especially kind of the public, because that's one of those things that was never in my kind of line of sight, and then suddenly everyone I know is talking about it.
I know. Well, I'm curious. What do you think about it? When people come to you and ask you as an author, what do you think about ChatGPT writing books? What's your reaction and what do you think?
I mean, I guess my gut reaction is, dear God, I hope they don't get good at it because I want to keep my job. That's my totally straightforward human answer. I mean, I guess if I was to sit down and think about it, I don't know. I mean, you look at you look at the art stuff, and you look at the problems that AI has with art, and that the people designing these systems are trying to work out. Like the AI thing with fingers is apparently a weird thing. I don't know enough about the behind the scenes to know why that's weird, but that's what I've heard. And I got to imagine that it's even more complex of a problem to deal with storytelling, because there's so much kind of going on with that. There's so many more kind of points of failure for a machine to try to replicate what a human can do in a 200,000 word book, for instance. So I mean, I think we're probably a long ways off still from someone being able to, give a prompt and then spit out a full readable novel. But who knows? Ugh.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's tricky, right? Because my reaction to this is in some ways very similar to yours, which is number one, do I feel a little bit threatened in some sense? Maybe I don't actually even know if I should feel threatened or not. On the one hand, right, there's the fact that again, I have to sort of tell myself to be very careful about not being deceived by stories. But my tendency is to go back and look at historical analogs to this sort of revolution and to think about what aspects of those revolutions did people get right before it happened, and what aspects did people not see at all until after it happened. So, for example, right, there's photography, right? When photography was invented, there was a huge amount of panic about what this would do for artists, because one of the things artists got hired to do was to paint portraits. That's one of the most lucrative and most important things that they did. And now, why would anybody hire a painter to paint a portrait when you can take a photograph, which is like so much better, quote unquote, in terms of representation and realism? And so there was all kinds of fears about what would happen. And then people were saying, oh, a photograph will not work because the subject has to sit there for 2 hours for the photograph to be taken. Nobody will want that. It just looks really not right. There was all sorts of like speculation. Of course, later what we saw was that some of the predictions were right, only in the sense if you squint real hard at it. Artists were, in fact, no longer hired to paint photorealistic portraits, or at least not unless you were extremely wealthy and wanted that. But art shifted into other realms, right? It became much less about representation, but much more about capturing feeling or emotion or evoking something. In some ways, the entire Western tradition of photorealism in art was wiped out, but that didn't mean art somehow lost its place. It just went in a different direction. So you could imagine that right now we're talking about novelists losing their jobs to AI. I have no idea if that will happen. Maybe, but if so, I got to think that humans will just end up doing something entirely different. As writers, we'll probably just go in a different direction with our storytelling. I don't know what that means. Like, what is the equivalent to abstraction in storytelling? And what does that mean, really? I don't know, but I just can't. I can't imagine that our fears are telling the whole story and that we've got the future right just by telling this apocalyptic vision of all the writers losing their jobs, wandering through the streets like zombies. I don't think that's what's going to happen.
I mean, I just do that normally. But it's
research, Brian. It's research.
Very much so. No, and I do think about these kind of things because it's impossible to kind of understand and predict what like the public is going to react to a certain thing in a certain way. Like maybe AI in 20 years is perfect at telling stories, and the public looks at that and goes, it still doesn't feel right to me. I'd prefer a human.
Right.
You don't know. It's really hard to tell. I mean,
or the alternative, which is these stories are so good that the machines authoring them must be intelligent. There's no other way. If the machine is able to tell these stories, then they're not just imitating, they're not just copying. They actually are thinking and experiencing, insofar as we believe that fiction authors are really presenting some unique take on reality, filtered through their personality. And we engage with it because it's a fellow intelligence, a fellow sentience. Then, insofar as machines can do this, the machines must be intelligent. I don't know. That seems to me a much more profound and unsettling and interesting outcome than merely, I can't write novels the way I do now. I don't know.
Yeah. No, for sure. It's like because then you suddenly have. There is a thing that can mimic human, emotional resonance. Is that mimicking or is that real? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Suddenly you're asking a million new questions about, did we just give birth to new intelligence?
Right. So in which case, the fact that I can't be a novelist anymore is the last thing I care about. I mean, that is a much more profound change in society. So I guess my answer is, I'm not particularly concerned about losing my job, because if we get to the point where machines can actually do that and they are sentient, then I think we have much more profound social changes to worry about than this.
Right. It's like trying to predict how dominoes will fall when each domino has an infinite number of dominoes that it could click against.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. But it's wild. It's still, meanwhile, it's just kind of fun to play with, something like ChatGPT or Midjourney and try to get it to make pictures. My daughters love to play with AI. I'm supposed to set up, a proper stable diffusion setup on my machine for them to play with, and I haven't had a chance to really do it. But what they've been able to do so far, just with the free version they can access online, it's pretty wild. They love giving it interesting prompts and see what sort of things come up.
I'm genuinely kind of the most fascinated with the idea of AI kind of replacing or sliding into the slot that like Google fulfills, because it's so simple and relevant to the average person. Like the other day, I had a friend of mine is a high school coach, and he said that he was using Chat GPT to do custom workouts for his kids. And he was just typing in some parameters, and then poof, it just gives him a workout. And then he could tweak it a little here and there. And so I went on there and I went, okay, give me a yoga routine for a guy in his late 30s that is overweight with rheumatoid arthritis. And it did in like 10 seconds. And I'm like, well, crap. Like, this is like such a customized and easy thing that
I'm with you.
Cuts so much out of my day.
Oh, I'm with you 100%. I mean, the fact that ChatGPT is finally presenting a real challenge to something like Google's search engine after 20 years is, to me, pretty profound. I mean, I remember when Google first came out, replacing Alta Vista and all of those predecessors. I mean, it was like magic. You could type in some terms and it would give you the exact page that gave you the answer. And I was just like, oh my God. I mean, they knew they had magic. That's why the, I'm feeling lucky button that was there because of that magic. But over the years, it's gotten harder and harder because, people have learned to optimize themselves for Google's ranking algorithm. So now it's very hard actually to find the relevant information. If I need to give my parents, say, instructions on how to uninstall a program or something, it's actually very hard for me to find a page that I think contains the good instructions, and even then to tell them where to find those instructions amongst all the ads and banners and all the other stuff, right? But you can now type into ChatGPT, write out the instructions for how to uninstall a program from Windows. And it does it. It gives you this really wonderful list. You can copy and paste. I mean, it's just so much better as a result. It definitely has, in a lot of scenarios for me, been the better search engine, quote unquote.
Well, and I find it fascinating, the idea, because we have almost been trained over kind of since the advent of the internet to kind of accept that there's going to be more and more noise in our lives every year. I mean, I would have been about 9 when my dad, got kind of dial-up internet, and he, put that on the family computer, and suddenly that was a thing I could play with a bit. And like just since then, kind of I've progressed to the point where, like you said, you go to a website and it's just ads and chaos and ads right in the center of the text. And so you're trying to pick your way through this thing to find information. And the idea that we could suddenly leap towards less chaos, that is very alluring to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. I mean, it's not even just the web design has gotten to be information hostile. It's just that even the very nature of the information itself has become noisy. Everything has to be wrapped up in so much commentary now and all this stuff. It's actually very hard to even pick out the piece that you care about. It's really interesting. And also just the rise of content farms. We talk about AI writing now, but semi-AI written junk has been on the internet since forever, and it's gotten even worse. It's to me, it's sort of astounding just how much we've allowed ourselves to accept the state of affairs as somehow normal. Like the fact that we have to install a bunch of extensions whose only job is to rewrite the HTML and filter out as much ads as possible, and that it is expected on the other side for the websites to detect that we're doing that and to pop up even more intrusive pop-ups and say, no, you can't. You have to watch ads, otherwise we'll go out of business. I mean, how did we allow ourselves to get into a position where seeing advertising and accepting advertising is the very lifeblood of the internet, that we're okay with the state of affairs and that we're like, this is fine. This is just the way it should be. It's astounding.
It is weird. I've reached a point in my life where, like when they talk about, oh, Netflix is going to start giving ads to their lowest tier subscriber, something like that. Like when that pops up, my brain immediately goes, I will pay any amount of money to not see ads. Like they have me fully hostage. If it's double the price, I'll pay that. My life is so full of chaos. I just want to entertain myself a little bit without that being interrupted.
Right. But of course, as you know, right, I mean, the newest trend is to just make it so that the ads are indistinguishable from the actual programming that you're interested in, because that's the holy grail, right? How can we get to the point where it's like you are not able to tell? You're just going to absorb this information as you're watching the thing that you want to watch. Oh, it's wild.
Well, and that's not new either. That's like okay, a certain type of car in a James Bond movie.
That's right. That's right.
But that's the most basic of advertisement of just, that it's there on the screen. You see it doing cool things. You see James Bond, drinking a certain type of beer with the label turned towards the audience, like that kind of stuff.
It's always very comical for me to watch, Apple shows because, the villains never use Apple products, right? That's just the way it is. They never do. And you're just like, okay.
I remember hearing that like a couple of years back, that was just like a contractual thing. And people saying like, look, it's just, if you want to spot the villain early, you see the person using a non-Apple product.
Right.
And then it won't be hidden from you.
Right.
It's a weird way to affect storytelling, right?
It's so funny, yeah.
It is strange how like that kind of the way that we interact with the world and kind of like our society around us just it bleeds into our entertainment like that. And
yeah.
That's not new either, like Greek philosophers were writing about issues that they were dealing with.
You're right, it's not new, but I also wonder to what extent it's more pervasive and affecting us in ways that it's very hard for us to tease apart. I mean, for example, right? I just recently sort of was realizing this. We've been trained over the last 20 years or so to accept photographs to look a certain way. And turns out that all the phone manufacturers have been sort of optimizing towards a similar look, which is this very saturated, kind of look for photographs. Which is very striking when you compare them to older film pictures. And the thing is, all of these phone cameras are doing their work based on computational photography, meaning they get their power from not necessarily because they have great lens, and they do, but because of physics, they're not as good as the lenses in your big, DSLRs. But they've been focusing their energy on the computational aspect of things. So all of these pictures you see are heavily manipulated by machine learning. They're being optimized to fit a certain profile that machines have learned from our, likes and upvotes to be what we collectively prefer. So slowly, we have been surrounding ourselves by looking at reality through these images that are heavily machine processed without really thinking about the fact that it's being machine processed. A lot of us have these images of places we've never been to, or places we never will go to, or people we've never really interact with. And it's all entirely shaped by these machine learning filters. It's an entirely specific style of art, but we don't give this style of art a name. We don't call it impressionism. We don't call it anything. It's just the way it is. We treat it as journalism, but it's not. It's filtered. It's heavily manipulated. And that's pretty profound. I mean, our ideas about what is beautiful, what is aesthetically pleasing, what is a realistic portrait of the world, being shaped, by AI in this way, but we don't really talk very much about it. And then I just don't know if that matters or not. Is this the sort of thing that will have an effect on us, or is it just sort of like the sort of thing I worry about, but it's really nothing? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and they that's brought up occasionally in terms of like the idea of deep fakes, right?
Yeah.
Like this idea that the thing that we have kind of we've grown to accept that what we see is what we get. Like that's the reality. And there's a very clear, okay, I'm watching fiction or I'm seeing what's real in the world. And your brain divides it that way. But then suddenly we can now create moving things that, it's not just Photoshop or, Stalin removing the, his disgraced lieutenants after the fact from a photo.
Well, you've got that Google ad at the Super Bowl, right? Where you can just like erase people, just circle it. It's gone.
Yeah. That's wild. Like our perspective on reality is going to have to change.
Well, you already see evidence of that, right? In the way people treat what is evidence and what is not. The proliferation of cell phone videos. So whenever something bad happens, police brutality or, incidents of racism, we have cell phone videos of what happened. So people post that. But the counterpart to that is if you don't have that kind of evidence, now people will not believe you because you can claim that this happened. And then people are like, well, where's your video? Where's the video? So the expectation that everything has to be proven by actual video, I think it's pretty insidious because the implication is without it, what happened to you is not real. That can have really negative consequences to victims and to just, in general, the way we think about what is true and what is not.
Is that the kind of thing that you would deal with when you were working as a consultant for like a professional witness, or?
No, when I was working as an expert witness, my focus was entirely on the technology side. It was my job to write expert reports to explain to the jury and the judge how things worked. For patent cases, I would explain, this is how the claims map to the technology. This is why this is not a patent violation. It's not infringement because, we don't do it. We don't do it within the claims. Things like that. But the sort of discussion we just had, that's the sort of thing I engage in as a fiction author. I mean, those are the bread and butter of my short fiction in particular. I love thinking about technology and how it changes the way we process reality, because my thing is I don't think technology is separate from humanity, right? My view is the idea that humanity needs to be opposed to technology in this sort of nature versus tech kind of binary thinking is not really true. Humans are fundamentally technological animals. Technology sort of is nothing more than the tangible manifestation of our mental patterns. So in the same way, you can't understand beavers without studying their dams, and you can't understand honeybees without understanding honeycombs. How can you understand humans without understanding human craft? So a lot of my fiction is about human craft as an aspect of humanity, that technology is not something that inherently makes us inhuman or whatever, but rather it's just a manifestation of some of our deepest humanistic tendencies. Like the examples we've been discussing.
Oh, I think that is stupidly interesting. Because look at humans. Like without our tools, we are useless pink meat bags, right?
Absolutely. And the language that we use, that is a technology. The language is a thing that we craft and shape constantly. I mean, look at how many arguments we have over language. If we didn't think language mattered, why would we have these arguments? We really do think language is magic, and it is a craft that we shape. It's a technology we shape. And then it ultimately becomes the very means through which we do thinking, right? There are a lot of people who think that language is not separable from thought, that you're incapable of thinking an idea unless you have the words for it, which I think is probably too extreme. I don't think that's actually true. But it does, to an extent, just show just how embedded technology and craft is in our lives. You cannot understand what human nature is without understanding human technology.
Yeah, and language, it just slots right in there. Like the ability to communicate and to work together, and to work together not just maybe on an emotional level, but on a physical level, to develop new tools and to
Absolutely.
strive towards a particular goal, you have to be able to clearly explain to another person what that goal is and how to reach it.
Yeah. I mean, language is amazing. As a piece of technology, it's just fascinating. It really does feel magical sometimes. I mean, the fact that, one human can convey a bunch of mental states to another person and to be able to trust that it will more or less be conveyed accurately such that you can trust the other person with your life. If you're both hunting the same, mammoth or something, you can be sure that when I say go around and flank them, they will do that, not end up being killed. I mean, it's astounding that we developed this technology and are able to use it and trust our very lives with it. It's amazing.
I do think about that sometimes when I'm writing, is this funny idea that I can put pictures in another person's head without using pictures.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Well, we are the original Midjourney. That's what we do, right? We type in prompts and Midjourney pops up a picture, right? We are the original Midjourney.
I'll think of myself like that from now on. Now, when you're writing, do you find yourself, because you're very interested in the way that history and the future kind of interacts, and this idea of predicting and failing to predict. When you're writing, do you ever run into do you ever kind of come in conflict with yourself, where you say, I want to write about this thing, but am I putting too much stock into the idea that I'm writing about? Like, do you ever kind of just, do the different parts of your brain ever run into each other?
Oh man, that is a fascinating question. Oh my gosh. I gotta think that's true of every writer, that they've had this sort of situation. I mean, I personally think it's very hard to write a character convincingly without empathizing with them in some way. So when I'm writing characters, I have to sort of empathize with their points of view, and stories about conflict. So I obviously end up empathizing with every side of a conflict. So I have to say, fundamentally, on some level, every conflict in a story is mappable to a conflict in the writer's brain. I mean, you have to. I've never actually thought about this question the way you just put it. But now that I think about it, that has to be true. I mean, when I was writing my big epic fantasy, I had to sort of, think about it from the perspective of every side in these massive conflicts. And in some ways, it has to represent some sort of myself working out the right solution to these almost irreconcilable differences and debates. Oh, man, that's fascinating. Does that happen to you? Now I got to turn around to you and ask the same thing.
I mean, I sometimes think that, gosh, I'm trying to remember the author that I heard talk about this once. He said that the real issue when you become a really experienced professional author, the real issue that you run into isn't coming up with ideas or getting them down. It's that you suddenly have too many things. You are able to kind of see ahead several steps in a dozen different ways how each scene can go. And so you're constantly trying to rein in your own predictions for the future of a narrative so that you can stay focused and so that you can work towards a goal. And I find that really interesting. And I find that happening to me more and more lately, where I get kind of frozen over what's happening next in my books, because I have so many things that could happen next that I suddenly lock up and then I write something that's perfectly competent, and then I go, oh, but I can do better. I'm going to rewrite that. I can do better. The narrative can be more entertaining. The future of this world could be more interesting. And then it leaves me in kind of this weird little spiral where I'm just like hammering my head against, maybe like a third of a book because I'm trying to get that perfect. And it doesn't have to be.
Oh, that's fascinating. This is sort of like the opposite of the writer's block. This is like the writer's hamster wheel problem. You're like spinning because you have so many possibilities. I love that.
Yeah, it's just it is wild, like that you can run into that kind of problem.
It also reminds me very strangely of of our discussion about AI, because, fundamentally something like ChatGPT is really nothing more than a language model that predicts what the next word is going to be. That's fundamentally how all of these models are. They're always predicting based on all the corpus, or corpora in a lot of cases, they've been trained on. What is the next word? What is the most likely word to come next? And sometimes, ChatGPT, some of these AI writing tools work by presenting the user with a bunch of alternatives, and you pick the one that you like, and so they can go on. It's a little bit like that. Maybe, our brains really do function in some level like these language models, and just constantly coming up with predictions.
Yeah, well, and it's like the human brain, it calculates at like an absolutely incredible speed for certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that really interesting, that we're just these like kind of meat computers,
Yeah.
That are kind of the sum of all of our experiences and all of our knowledge and what we can have at our fingertips. I'm definitely curious how that will kind of change the way that we like interact as human society over the next 100 years.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious about to what extent these models can really give us real insights into the functioning of the human brain. I mean, there is a lot of very fascinating aspects about these language models that no one could have predicted. I mean, for example, the fact that this sort of brute force approach of using a neural network to be trained on a lot of data to generate new stuff, the fact that this approach has worked so well, I think has astounded everyone. Even the most ardent connectionist, I think, could not have predicted the degree of success we've achieved. I mean, when I was in college and studying AI, that was back when, it was in the middle of the AI winter, and the idea that you can get to real AI simply by using a very simple neural network to absorb a lot of data and just do it real fast would have been laughable. I don't think anybody I knew at the time believed that this could be done. And even the people who have done it are kind of astounded by how successful it's been. And if you ask them exactly how this works, I think everybody will say, we're not entirely sure, because, peering into the neural networks and seeing the weights, we don't really fully understand how it's working. So there's the theory that, any model sufficiently complicated to generate human-like utterances are probably too hard for our brains to comprehend, which is pretty amazing if you think about it, that we can build a model to imitate ourselves, and in that process fail to understand the very model that we've built. To me, it's both kind of beautiful and scary, at the same time, to think that.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I mean, that's something that scares normal people a lot, is this idea, like, you talk to a doctor about some of the minutia of what he does, and you will very quickly run into, yeah, that's a thing with the human body we don't understand yet. We're trying to figure out.
Right, exactly.
Like, and you think of the advances that we've had in things like medicine,
mm-hmm.
and understanding the human body, the human brain, and then you suddenly realize how little we know. That, like, your brain just blows up when you try to grasp those things.
Well, it's got to keep us humble, right? I mean, I hear people confidently saying, "Oh, we will achieve, total artificial intelligence in 5 years, or we will all live in the cloud, by the time, 20 years rolls around." And you're just like, how can you be confident about any of this? We know so little.
All right. So, Ken, I like to ask everyone at the end of the episode a sort of left field question. What's the last thing that you ate that blew your mind?
Okay. We were on vacation in Las Vegas, and we went to this really nice steakhouse. And I figured, you don't do this very often in life, so you might as well do it once. We got one of those $100 steaks. So I had that, and it was good. I mean, I consider myself a pretty good griller, but that $100 steak was not something I could have done myself. So yeah.
Do you remember what it was?
It was a filet mignon. It was done with a mushroom sauce. It sounds very standard, but whatever it is, the magic of the preparation was such that it really was better than what I could have done myself.
I'm definitely one of those people that I don't think that steak is the end all be all of great meals, like some people do, but a really well done steak, oh my gosh, it can just hit you in a place that you didn't even know. It's like the weird, like prehistoric part of your brain is going, this is amazing.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It totally was incredible. It was a very good meal.
I did one of those once with some friends where we went to like a really high end steak house. One of those special meals when you haven't seen each other for years, you get together, you do a nice meal together. And I got it was the first time I'd ever done steak à poivre, which is the steak with the creamy pepper sauce.
Oh,
and since then I taught myself how to make it. Oh my gosh, it's so much fun. Made even more fun when your wife thinks that you're burning down the kitchen. But it's just one of those, like, it is actually stupidly simple to do. Like, it's really not hard, but it seems so fancy.
wow.
And then you're like, oh, this tastes just like the restaurant.
I got to try that. That is amazing. Okay.
Highly recommend the steak à poivre. And I'm also a total sucker for filet mignon. Everybody will argue about, what's the best cut, and a lot of people look at the filet and they're like, oh, that's passe. That's what people used to love.
Sure.
I love a filet. It's
good.
It doesn't have a gristly fat on it. It's very straightforward and clean.
Yep. But sometimes the simple stuff, if you do it well, it really is amazing.
Oh yeah, for sure. That was author and presenter Ken Liu. You can find links to Ken's social media and website down in the show notes. You can find me, as always, at brianmcclellan.com. Special thanks to James Sutter for music and Tom Bishop for production. If you'd like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak or buy my books in ebook, paperback, or audio. You can also get signed copies of my books direct from my website or swag from my Redbubble store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. If you're listening to this via Patreon, please stick around for bonus chat during the epilogue. Special thanks to Elijah, Ivor Gullickson, James Clark, Jennifer Johnson, Jason Knoll, Kyle Anderson, Sexton Hardcastle, Talon, Brian, Will Lebelski, Bradley Thornhill, and Roberto Fontata for their backing on Patreon.